Merci beaucoup. Bonjour tout le monde. Je m'appelle Michael Noel. Je me pardonne, je parle un petit peu de français, mais j'ai présenté en anglais because my French just isn't good enough to speak for 50 minutes in French. But it's great to be back, at least virtually here. I truly wish I could be there in Nice right now. I imagine it's a fantastic day. I've only been to Nice once. I really enjoyed my time there, and I'd love to come back at some point in the future. But it's not to be, at least not this year. Hopefully next year is a better year, and I hope everyone is staying safe and sound. But let me introduce myself for those of you who haven't had the opportunity to connect with me in person. My name is Michael Noel, and I'm based out of San Francisco in the United States. I do a lot of public speaking around the world, most years, not so much this year, but I've included a map here, just kind of give you an idea. This is a Power BI map that I created of all the different speaking locations around the world that I've spoken at over the past decade, or just over a decade or so. So. I've had a chance to present in Paris. I have not presented in the south of France, but like I said, I have been there a few times. So again, hopefully next year, hopefully some other time, come back again and have a chance to present in person. But just a little bit more about my background. I did a lot of books around SharePoint, as well as some other Microsoft technologies. My SharePoint books was actually translated into French a few years back. I think it was around actually a decade ago. I think it was my SharePoint 2010 book. I work as a consultant at a Microsoft partner based out of San Francisco. And so we have a lot of clients that we work with to set up their infrastructure. And more recently, of course, to work with the Azure cloud and Office 365, do migrations, set them up. Recently, I've been spending about the past year and a half working very heavily in the Microsoft security space. So that's a lot of the reasons why I'm doing this particular presentation today, is because it's based on my experiences working with these particular Microsoft security tools. So that said, let's dive right into this here. One of the things that's really changed within the past 2 years is that the tools and techniques that IT used to use to control security have changed significantly, and that's because the type of attacks that we're seeing have changed. The attackers have gotten more sophisticated. They've gotten a lot more resources, so a lot more money behind them. In some cases, they're actually sponsored by individual state governments. And what that means is they're also able to bypass a lot of the traditional security measures which IT organizations had in place. So we're seeing things such as spear phishing attacks. Those are phishing attacks which target individuals within your organization that have been vetted out. So they've spent some time taking a look at who your finance people are. They've started to take a look at who your executives are, the people leading the organization, and they'll specifically target them, oftentimes with information that that person feels that should only be known by a close friend or a confidant or somebody else. So they may take over an account of a colleague. They may impersonate an account of someone that you believe you should be doing business with, or they may, for example, completely, we've seen cases where they've taken over an organization and trying to send invoices and trying to send payments directly from the established finance routes of those organizations. So those types of attacks are actually quite effective, because the people at the other end of the attack, because they're expecting to communicate and collaborate with these people, they oftentimes will share information, or they'll click on links or they'll download some attachment. It's not uncommon to think that an executive receiving a spreadsheet from a partner would expect it to contain useful information. So they might try to open it. That might include infected malware. A lot of times those types of malwares can do things like completely take over that person's system, do keylogger so that you can see everything that that person's typing. You can take over their camera. You can do any number of things. So we're starting to see spear phishing as a major attack vector, and that's causing a lot of issues with our clients. These state-sponsored attacks, you've probably heard of the famous one with Sony Pictures, where certain government got upset at the way that they were depicted, and they decided to reach out and send a message to the organization that funded that film. But there's also other state-sponsored attacks that we're seeing more often. There's things like Sea Turtle, which affected different nonprofits. And there's constant state-sponsored attacks from states that have a vested interest in the other state, either losing their intellectual property or looking bad because they got hacked, for example. As well, we see a lot of intellectual property theft and loss. Now, some of this, of course, is due to malicious attacks, but in most cases, what a lot of people don't realize is the majority of those, in fact, by some statistics, somewhere over 90% of IP loss is actually due to accidental oversharing of information. So this is due to somebody going in and sharing a sensitive repository of data with the public. Making a link which is available to the public, or making it available to somebody that they didn't mean to make it available to. So it's not, even if you fully trust all of your people, if you don't necessarily have tools in place to prevent those types of things, that type of oversharing of data, you may end up with a situation where you're losing your sensitive company data. At the same time, we start to see more and more data integrity challenges. Just last week, we saw 3 new ransomware attacks on some of our clients alone, which is pretty impressive considering we're not a major organization, we're not huge. These types of things are happening more and more often, and all it takes is the hacker to get into one workstation that ideally, in the hacker's case, has some kind of elevated privileges, but they don't even necessarily need to have elevated privileges, because a lot of times organizations will have file shares where everybody can make changes to. And once they're in, then they go out and encrypt all the data that they can reach across the entire organization, which, by the way, if that person's a domain administrator, that can be every single workstation, and leave them in a state where the only way to decrypt them is by paying a cryptocurrency ransom. So most organizations don't pay the ransom, but that means that they have to go through a costly rebuilding process. They have to restore everything from backup. That's serious for most organizations. We actually had the local train and bus company here in San Francisco they basically had to open all the turnstiles and allow everybody in free for an entire day, because they had been hit by ransomware and all their computer systems were all offline. So great for people riding the bus, not so great for the company running things. And I actually felt really bad for the IT manager at that place, because he had just started his job 2 weeks before that. So you can imagine how much fun that was to come into a new job and to suddenly be hit by a ransomware attack. So in any case, I say that because that was public, by the way, but these types of things are happening all of the time, and you've got to be able to detect when someone gets into your organization and tries to start doing those lateral attacks right from the beginning. We see, the common attack vectors take place with device security. So that's just losing laptops, compromising systems. If you don't have the proper encryption in place, if you don't have the proper logins in place, someone can take over, pull things off of your hard drive. I actually had I have a good friend of mine who did a study. What they did is they went around to different flea markets, what we call flea markets or bazaars, places where they resell equipment, and they just bought up every hard drive they could think of, every hard drive that was available at these different flea markets around the world. and then they did a study on all the data that was on them, and it was actually shocking how much confidential data was stored on these hard drives. People don't realize, for example, you shut a printer off. Well, that printer, most modern printers have hard drives on them, and a lot of times that's unencrypted data. And the hard drive includes the last things that were printed that were part of that queue. So oftentimes people get access to data that way. So we see those types of things, device security being an issue. All while this is happening, the information department is overwhelmed. They may be receiving logs from the firewalls, the syslogs, or sending them to a central repository, but it's really hard to determine what's an actionable threat within those logs. So you may have gigabytes and gigabytes and terabytes of logs out there, but if you're not knowing about the one log a day that's really, really important to know about, or the specific situation where there's some malicious activity that looks a little bit odd, but you don't know because the logs are just piling up. Well, that's what we call the noise to signal ratio. That's trying to determine, what's a signal within that noise itself. And IT is overwhelmed. We're understaffed. There's a lot less people working today in IT than there used to be, and that makes it just that much harder to stay one step ahead of attackers. But again, all it takes is one major hack against your organization, and all of a sudden, I'll tell you, management will start to pay attention to security. And that's generally when we see the budgets open up for, hey, let's take a real look at security. Let's open up and see what kind of security tools are out there. And that's really where some of what we'll be talking about here comes into play, because most organizations end up owning or potentially get very close licensing wise to owning some of these tools that we'll be talking about, and they're relatively easy to implement. I liked this particular comic just because it touches on a few things about passwords, which of course annoy people. One of the things that's annoying today is, if you go back 20 years, the password of your dog might have been okay. I mean, I'd probably argue that it wasn't, but let's say a lot of people had simple passwords out there, and a lot of people reused passwords, because who can keep track of all these passwords that are out there? And nowadays, though, one of the problems is that anymore, the attackers are getting much more sophisticated, and I'll give you one of the ways in which they gain access to your password, and this is extremely common today. I'd say at least 50% of corporate passwords in most, let's say, modern Active Directory environments are using a password that has been reused somewhere else. And most of those passwords, let's say 40% out of the total passwords, are actually stored in what are called dark web databases. And these dark web databases are not so dark. You can actually access them. I put a link at the bottom. There's a white hat guy who runs a website called haveitbeenpwned.com, where you can test your password about to see if it's actually in one of these databases. Now, I don't normally recommend you entering your password into any site that's not your corporate site. This one is an actual site that will test it against that database, or you can download some tools. There's some various vendor tools that allow you to do that, including, by the way, some Microsoft tools that you can use to run dark web database dictionary attacks against your existing passwords, as long as you have domain admin access. So what ends up happening is, again, people have too many passwords. Their corporate password matches their Facebook password, which is their Gmail password, which matches some small website out there that they had to register for. Well, a lot of times those small websites are the ones that get compromised. So someone manages to gain access to the password databases. They crack the hash because maybe they're not using a good hash algorithm, or maybe that site isn't even using proper hashes in storing the passwords. So they're storing them in clear text, for example. It happens a lot. And at that point, what they do is they go and they say, okay, this user John at companyabc.com registered on this particular external website as John at companyabc.com and use this password. Well, let's turn around and try to log into Office 365. And lo and behold, a lot of times the passwords match. And that's really where things like multi-factor authentication come into place, because at least in those scenarios, when they've compromised the password, there's another factor that they would need to compromise. At the same time, in terms of good password policies, one of the things I try to get my clients into the get comfortable with is using the concept of a password phrase. A password phrase is actually much easier for a human to remember, but it is much more difficult for a computer to try to hack. So if you use a good randomly generated password phrase, I give an example there: yellow birdseed, hat, pumpkin. Humans can remember, oh, yellow birdseed and then a hat on a pumpkin. That's my password. It takes a little bit longer to type in, but at that point, again, as long as it's unique, it's nearly impossible to crack that because it's a really long password. Maybe you put some complexity in it. Maybe you put a number at the end or what have you. But humans, again, we're going to remember that much easier than the computer is going to be able to hack against that. So think about using passphrases instead of using passwords, because the concept of the password, we think we're so sophisticated by replacing the A with an ampersand or replacing the S with a dollar sign. All of that stuff is in the cracked password databases that are out there. So you kind of, it doesn't really help just by replacing your P ampersand dollar sign word. That's in the database, I guarantee you. At the same time, what we see when these hackers gain access to a single user is they immediately start to do what's called a lateral attack. And what a lateral attack is that they determine what type of level of access that user has, and then they try to go through and compromise systems on the side. Now, you may think to yourself, well, my admins, are using more complex passwords, or I have MFA in place for all my admins, so I don't really need to worry about that. But one of the things people forget about, this is an extremely common method of gaining access to domain credentials, is if somebody at some point logs into a workstation, let's say they're troubleshooting, let's say they're fixing their printer, they log into that workstation using elevated credentials. Maybe they're only slightly elevated, or maybe in a lot of cases, and this happens all the time, they're domain admin credentials. And they log into that machine and they have their cached password now stored on that machine. If someone a hacker is now able to take over that machine, and lo and behold, especially if that user they took over is a local admin, which happens, I'd say, at least half of the time in the clients that I see out there. If that system is a local admin, they now have unfettered rights to attempt to crack that local cached password of the domain admin. And guess what? If that domain admin didn't follow best practices and their password is in one of those dictionary attacks of the 770 million passwords that are in those dark web databases, they'll get in within a matter of seconds. And if they follow best practices and at least it's a certain number of digits long, maybe it takes them longer. So for example, 8 digits, depending on modern computers, might take them a decent amount of time, might take them a few days, but they'll eventually crack that password. 12 is going to be nearly impossible, which is why I generally recommend our admins set their passwords for really long values. But once they have that, they now have a domain admin or an elevated credential, and they can start to then laterally do attacks. They can do things like create what's called a golden ticket. And this is a little ingenious thing that someone figured out years ago. Because the way that Kerberos works, it creates tickets, and those tickets are supposed to be only valid for a certain period of time. Well, a golden ticket is a Kerberos ticket which is invalid forever. And once you create that, even if someone then locks out the account that creates that ticket is still valid, and they can then start to use it to access other resources. So golden ticket attacks are one example of that. I put another example in the screenshot. There's what's called a DC sync attack. That's where a system tries to pretend that it's a domain controller and requests replication traffic from that domain controller. And if things aren't set up properly, that domain controller will replicate the database to it, including the ntds.dit, which includes the password file. So that can be highly compromising for an organization. So lateral attacks, these types of things happen. So how do you deal with this? What are the solutions without having to, for example, go out and and purchase of an MSSP or redo your entire organization and install a bunch of on-prem tools to look for security or expensive security devices. Well, Microsoft has created a stack of tools that can assist with a lot of these different layers of the security framework. So there's what's called, if you've heard of it before, it's called the National Institute of Security and Technology, or NIST. And what that is it's basically a governmental organization here in the States. It's also used internationally that categorizes the security model into various layers. So they categorize it in identifying security issues, protecting against them, detecting when there's an actual incident occurring, responding to those, and recovering. And I've kind of categorized the different Microsoft tools in these in terms of this particular framework here. So we'll go into a little bit more detail about each one of these, but I just wanted to kind of give you an idea of the resources and the way that Microsoft has positioned these particular tools. All right, so I'll start with actually one of my favorite tools here. This is something I use on a regular basis now. It's a tool called Microsoft Cloud App Security, and I'll show you a demo in my demo tendency here. I'll show you this here in a bit. But what it is it's what they call a multi-mode cloud access security broker. And what that means, it's a big word that basically means it's a cloud-based security tool that examines your cloud infrastructure and sees what your users are doing. So it sees, which type of cloud services they access, and then it goes on the back end and it provides alerts against those services. So it'll tell you, for example, if there's a known issue at, let's say, at Dropbox, and it'll tell you, you have 30 users using Dropbox, and there was a known issue with Dropbox. You should contact these users to do things like reset their passwords, for example. Excuse me. So the idea then is you can proactively identify threats that exist in between cloud platforms. You'll get alerts on things like when someone does a mass upload of data. So they may take data from your internal network and they may mass upload it to Dropbox, and maybe that's against your policies. You also get alerts that say things like, oh, this user publicly shared data out to the outside, or publicly shared confidential files, or they logged in from an IP address that's a known risky IP address. That's something that when you see that kind of activity, 80% of the time, it's a real issue, especially if you don't have MFA in place. I guarantee if you see that kind of stuff pop up, it means someone's been compromised and someone needs to take a look at it. So it's a fantastic tool to forensically go back and take a look at what your users are doing if you're trying to do some kind of an audit trail of where they've been. But it's also a great tool to be able to then get a better understanding of what your users are doing within the cloud itself. There's another set of tool sets. It's one of my second favorite Microsoft tool set in terms of security. There are two versions of this tool. Most of the time, you'll be dealing with the ATP version of the tool. There is an on-prem version only that's called ATA. We have very few clients that use that because, honestly, it's kind of a pain, especially nowadays cloud-connected world. You want Microsoft to be able to maintain and manage that stuff for you. But ATP and to a lesser extent ATA, what they are it's a cloud-based service that relies on agents that run in your domain controllers. And those agents that run in your domain controllers will feed information back into the cloud to look for specific types of things. This is where they look for golden ticket attacks. They look for DC sync attacks. They are looking for the types of attacks that you would normally expect to see, or that traditionally people have seen against Active Directory environments. So putting this in place provides you some really rich and actionable data and alerts. So you can actually see what's happening and see, for example, someone attempting to do a lateral attack, and then either automatically or manually go in and make some changes and do some activities against those systems. So great tool for being able to manage those type of environments. And there's also, by the way, a desktop-based version of the tool. you may see it called MDATP. That's Microsoft Defender Advanced Threat Protection, and that's a series of agents. If you think of them like antivirus and anti-malware agents that you deploy to your Microsoft systems. And by the way, that can include Windows and can include Linux. So they have Linux agents now. It used to be called Windows Defender. They changed it to Microsoft because it's no longer just Windows. But that's a heuristic scanning engine that'll tell you what's going on from your workstation perspective. Another really, really great tool, I've been using this with a few clients as well, is it's what's called a SIEM. That's a security information and event management platform. You may have seen other SIEMs out there. There's a whole third-party space. In my opinion, some of those tend to be overly complicated and very expensive. Microsoft has a cloud-based version called Sentinel. And if you can think of it as kind of a dumping ground for all of your Active Directory logs, you send all your login logs up into Sentinel. It's a logs analytics workspace in Azure. But as well, it has a bunch of different tools. It has hunting tools, so you can go in and see weird activity. So you see, why is it that we have this large number of users that are authenticating using down-level NT-landman authentication instead of using modern authentication? And so you can go spill into specifics and try to figure out, are these security issues, or usually it's just some old systems or some misconfiguration. But it's a great way to kind of determine, how to improve the security of your environment by getting rid of some of those older systems, by looking for attack vectors. You see that map there. That's actually really a rudimentary map. I can't really show you production environment, of course, but most of the production maps will show you this beautiful heat map of all of the different attacks that are happening, because you can do things like forward your firewall logs. So if you have a checkpoint or Cisco firewall or a Palo Alto network firewall, you can forward those logs into Sentinel, and you can forward logs from other syslog services and then be able to do log queries against them. So look for changes people made, an audit trail, look for logins that people made, and determine, again, if there's security issues, or go back and help investigate a case. You may have a lawsuit or something like that where you need to provide access to legal to be able to go in and take a look at various paths that people took. So a great tool. This is licensed separately. I'll talk about licensing a little bit at the end. Another really interesting tool. Most people don't realize this because a lot of people think this is just the third-party space, but there's something called Azure AD Password Protection, which allows you to extend your Active Directory password policies beyond what the default is able to do. So we mostly know what the defaults are, and honestly, they haven't changed much since the NT days. This is require complexity, uppercase, lowercase, a symbol, require a certain amount of characters, a minimum password length, maximum password length. But we can't do things like check dark web databases. We can't do things like stop them from using their name, stop them from using the name of the company. And so Microsoft has a tool that it actually works by installing agents on domain controllers, different agents than the ATP agents. But these modify the password filter DLL and allow you to establish policies to then restrict what's happening, restrict the way that people are changing their passwords. So they can no longer change their password to a known password that's in a dark web database. They can no longer change it to their name. They can no longer change it to whatever it is that they change it to. I'm sure there are common French passwords that are out there because there's common English ones. Right now, for example, one of the most common passwords out there is fall 2020, right? I guarantee you next spring that's going to change to spring 2021. People are really bad about that. You can kind of protect against those kind of things with something like Azure AD Password Protection. Azure AD Entitlement Management. This is a kind of an area that encompasses several different tools, and it's a bit of a mouthful. But what it is it's a compliance and auditing control platform that allows you to control access to your Azure resources by creating different packages that control what type of rights will be granted, which approvers can grant those rights, and when they expire. So you've probably been in that situation, almost everybody has, where you need to grant some vendor or somebody else temporary access to some application, but you don't want them to have access to it for a long time. And it's a difficult thing to do. You can give them a password to the service account, and then you can change it later, or you can go through the process of granting their accounts rights, and then you forget about removing it later. All of these things make it really challenging to give someone rights to a different application. And Azure AD Entitlement Management can assist with that. That includes, by the way, a tool which I find highly useful called PIM. And what PIM is, it's a cloud-based tool that allows you to specify that nobody is a permanent, let's say, global admin in Azure or any of the other roles in Azure. You have to request rights to be an admin at the beginning of the time when you do your work. And that goes through an approval process. So you can have, in this case, you can see Jennifer is, she's a permanent global admin. That's generally, we try to avoid that. But Lee is eligible, which means that Lee has to request rights to be a global admin, and then it has to go through an approval process. The clients that I use this at, when I start my work, I generally first go through and request. I'm not a global admin, or I'm not an admin on a permanent, which also is good in the case of lateral attacks, because if someone does manage to compromise my credentials, they are not automatically a global admin in Azure. They can't suddenly start making huge changes, which does happen when people get a hold of the Azure credentials. So PIM is a great tool to control access into your cloud space. Now, Microsoft actually has an on-prem version of PIM that's called PAM. Now, many of you have been working with Microsoft for a long time, knows that Microsoft gets a little out of control with their acronyms sometimes, and bless them, that's just something that they do. PIM and PAM are separate tools. PAM is a on-prem version. It's an on-prem service that sits on top of another service called MIM. And MIM itself, by the way, has a bunch of different acronyms that it's gone through. It's a 20-year-old tool, 20-plus-year-old tool now, that was MMS, MIS, ILM, FIM, and now MIM. So in any case, that's an identity management platform. But the way that PAM works is it sits on top of MIM and provides for a mechanism in which you can automatically add someone into an Active Directory group to give them rights to a particular application. So that way, for example, nobody's a domain admin by default, but PAM would add their account in as a domain admin. And in a perfect world with PAM, you actually use a concept called a bastion environment. And what a bastion environment is it's a separate Active Directory forest that contains your administrator accounts. You've got a one-way trust into that environment. So your corporate forest, actually, and if I get my cursor back here, this corporate forest here trusts Bastion, but not the other way around. That way, what you can do is put all your admin accounts in Bastion, and when you need to elevate, you give that admin account, you add it into, let's say, the domain admins group, or you add it into another privileged group in the corporate environment, and it's given an expiring token so that it's only eligible to be in that group for, let's say, 90 minutes or a day or whatever you specify. Usually we try not to go more than 10 hours or so for elevation. So you can use Bastion environments outside of using PAM. You don't have to use, I want to point out, it's a separate concept. We've had clients create Bastion forests for their admin accounts, and they have them generally added in, or they have a process in place where they add them in manually on a regular basis. It's not as secure as PAM, because PAM will do that automatically for you, but it is a lot more secure than having all of your admins sit in your corporate environment. So it's something to think about. We're starting to see Bastion environments, particularly because this being a brand new forest, this Bastion environment being a brand new forest, you can set it up to all the best practices. You can lock it down to military spec. You can have it and the latest Windows Server 2019 server core, no GUI, everything the way that it's supposed to be. And that's something really hard to do in most AD environments, because a lot of applications are tied into the Active Directory environment, and they have restrictions around forest level. They have restrictions around what you can control, the levels. So oftentimes I do encourage our clients to start with a bastion and start with the highest privileged accounts, like domain admins, try to move them over, and then slowly move the rest of your admins into that bastion environment. Another tool Microsoft provides is something called Azure Information Protection. And ultimately what Azure Information Protection is it's a tool that provides the ability to control what happens to the data after it's been accessed. And it does that by assigning different information policies to the content. And those policies can utilize services like Azure Rights Management Services. And what Azure Rights Management Services does is it restricts what the clients are able to actually do with the data. So they can't copy and paste content. They're not allowed to save another version of the file. The best they can do is pull out their phone and take a picture of the screen, because you're not even allowed to screenshot. Of course, someone, like I said, can take a picture of the screen, but it's going to be a lot harder to download, gigabytes of data, put it on a thumb drive, and take it out of your secured facility if you're using something like the rights management services. In best case scenario, you're taking pictures with your phone, in which case you probably get caught because they check your phone on the way out. So, that's the kind of thing that something like RMS can do. It has things built in now. There's actually technologies, holds your own key. It allows you to use your own keys. So Microsoft doesn't even have the rights to decrypt your content. So we see more and more clients using services like that. Azure Security Center. This is built into every Azure tenancy, even the free ones. So if you have an Azure environment that's out there, I encourage you to play around with it. Again, there's free ones that are there. You can do a certain amount of things in Azure, even free. So, but every Azure tenancy has a security center, and the security center has different recommendations that they give you, and they'll tell you, you should do this to secure your systems. You should put these firewalls in place. There's these alerts that are out there. We think you may be compromised. Depending on the level of Azure Security Center that you have, the standard tier, for example, will give you much more complex and custom alerts. But like I said, the free environment does give you some optimizations. So I highly recommend that you take a look at that, including look at your secure score. Just go to securescore.microsoft.com. That'll take you right into the Security Center Secure Score area. And that will tell you a lot of things about what's working against you security-wise. All right, so I've included a rough calculation. I apologize. These are in USDs. The euro equivalents somewhat similar, but this should give you an idea of roughly the way that Microsoft runs the licensing on this. And I should point out, Microsoft changes their licensing all the time, so please do check with Microsoft. I don't intend to be the end all in terms of Microsoft licensing, but usually when we get to the point where we start talking about what tools you own, we use this matrix here. So of course the best tools, my favorite tools, Microsoft Cloud App Security or MCAS, ATP, those are available with the premium P2 licensing and or the E5 Microsoft 365 E5 licensing, which includes those tools as well. But you can kind of see we are getting things like MFA all the way down to pretty much everything but the free version. And once again, you've got to use MFA. If one thing you take out of this is that the thing you need to deploy immediately for your users is multi-factor. It's the first thing we do with our clients. We say, get multi-factor in on all your accounts. It may be a little bit of extra work for your users, but once it's in place, if you played around with the early versions, you were constantly prompted. Most of that has gone away because they fixed the Office client issues, but we highly recommend it. It drastically reduces the amount of security incidents that our clients used to see before they turn on MFA. But again, you can kind of see how Microsoft licenses this. They're all licensed either via their P1, P2, or the whole Office 365 SKUs, except for Sentinel. Out of things that I talked about, Sentinel is a pay-as-you-go. So you pay primarily for ingestion of the data, but you'll also pay for retention of the data. So depending on how long you're keeping that data, you'll pay a price on top of the ingestion price. So again, this should give you a rough idea of what that looks like. So I'm gonna go take a peek here into Can you guys still see the screen? It doesn't look like it's sharing it, so let me make sure I'm sharing this again. Okay. Someone chime in if you can't see it, because it now shows you being able to see. So hopefully you can see this here.
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Chloe. So this is Cloud App Security, and this is a sample tenancy. So it's going to be nothing like what you would see in your own environment, but it gives you an idea. You know, I don't log into this that often, but I did log into it today. So guess what? I show up on the map as where I log in from. I can take a look at some of the existing alerts that were out there in the past. It's showing me as coming in from an infrequent country just because, again, I haven't logged in for such a long time. Most of the time you see those alerts when someone logs in from a place like Syria or something like that. But you can go back and take a look at specific alerts which may have been in place. Again, the sample tenancy has almost nothing to speak of, but I can, let me take a look at something a little bit more interesting. I can take a look at the number of apps that are there. Once again, this tenancy doesn't have anything interesting, so not much to see there, but I think they have some of the users populated. Let's see what we have here. Let's look at the Cloud App Catalog. This is how Microsoft rates the security applications. Surprise, surprise, most of the Microsoft tools are rated 10, but you can search for other applications that are out there and see, you know, how Microsoft rates them, see why they might give a downside to certain applications. You know, in this case, they don't have a good audit trail, they don't have MFA in place. They're not using, you know, they're not complying with specific protocols that are out there. So, you know, this gives you an idea. I actually use this sometimes on a regular basis when someone says, hey, we want to use, you know, this particular tool. What do you think about it? Well, I can go and evaluate it based on the Cloud App Security framework. I mentioned ATP. ATP, this will give you a little bit better information because Microsoft in their sample tenancy actually did a few sample attacks to kind of get an idea of what's going on here. And you can see when I actually, well, actually way back when Microsoft was setting up these attacks, they did things like add accounts to the administrators group. Well, that's something that's considered to be a little odd, or something that, you know, could be sign of an attack. They tried to run some remote code, so we can actually take a look and see what's going on. You know, what did they do on this particular machine? What kind of code was tried to run? You know, this guy's the CISO, so I should be concerned about him. And we actually, you know, can see the system that he logged in as, see what kind of lateral attacks are being made from that system. Okay, I don't know if it's just locked up, or sometimes when these tenancies get really old, they don't expect it to be to be all that. Here we go. So here's the finance manager. I should be concerned about this guy, but if you go back and look historically at what he was doing, I can see what's probably normal activity. But then we get to the point where his account gets compromised and he starts to log and access different finance systems. I can take a look historically at this. And by the way, from a European privacy perspective, there's actually a flip switch that you can put into there where most admins don't actually see the name. So you actually have to have privileges. So in other words, you're just following user X. You don't know who it is. And they tell you, okay, we need to investigate user X. And you can, you know, your admins can do that without actually knowing the name of the person, which I think is actually kind of useful, especially if you have a high privacy environment. But then I can take a look laterally and see if there's different resource, you know, what it is that they accessed, how many IP addresses they used, do I consider these to be a risk? You know, when did that user log into it? As well as, again, other things. You're going to see, like I said, a lot more useful information in a tenancy that has much richer data in it. This is Microsoft's Office Security, Security and Compliance Center. You'll notice, of course, they have a bunch of information. They have a GDPR dashboard that's specific to a lot of, you know, I'm sure a lot of your organizations are have to be compliant with GDPR, but they also allow you to specify different threat management policies. And a lot of these are available directly within Office 365. So I can create different anti-phishing attacks, which, you know, I can add specific conditions. If it's a specific user, like my finance user, we want to specify different spoofing settings, advanced settings. Okay, I'd have to go back and figure out who that user is. Recipient, I forget which users there are. Jeff, oh, here we go. Let's just pick this one. Where's the settings for this? And they changed the interface on me. So essentially, at this point, if anybody is sending an email to that particular user, it's going to implement the anti-phishing policy, which will then put additional restrictions and prevent, for example, that user from clicking on links that are included as part of that policy. So oftentimes we'll include finance users or elevated users or sometimes management in these policies. Depends on how your organization is structured and how, let's say, IT friendly your management is. But this is just one example. Again, we have a lot of different policies. We can do DLP policies, records management policies, information governance policies. These are all part of the Azure AD identity protection policies that are included in Office 365. So just, again, a brief foray into what it is that we can do with these particular tools. Let me go back and share my slide deck. One second. If for some reason you don't see it, let me know, but I'm going to flip to the last slide here. And I think I just have maybe a couple minutes left for questions. I'm not sure how questions work or if you're able to answer them, but if you're not, please note my contact information up there. Once again, I've been to France many times. I'd love to come back, hopefully next year, renew my travels. I have a plan to visit every country in the world, and I only have 16 countries left. I've been to 175, I think, at this point. So there's only a few countries left to visit. I share a passion of travel with, of course, Patrick. I know he's a big traveler as well too. So hopefully I'll get to see him again as well too on some of these additional travels. But that said, I'm running out of time. I do have a few minutes left for questions. So if you have any questions, please let me know.
Thank you, Michael, for taking some time with us.
No problem, pas de problème. Merci beaucoup, Patrick.
It was a great session. I think a great overview of all the security stuff. It's very hard to explain everything in a few minutes or 60 minutes. So thank you very much.
Agreed. Thank you so much. Yes, there's a lot to see, a lot to do. Obviously, we could break every one of these tools out into its own session, and maybe even more so. So, agreed.
No.
How is Nice today?
Very sunny. We are very lucky.
This is good.
Yes, a week ago there was some storm and very bad weather with some destruction, with flood in the Nice area, but it's finished today.
This is good. Well, enjoy. I'm sorry I couldn't be there. Hopefully next year.
Yeah, sure. You are definitely. That would be a good idea to have you.
Wonderful. Thank you.
So, pas de questions pour Michael. Si vous hésitez à les poser en français, je peux traduire. S'il reste des participants sur l'offre de sécurité globalement. Okay. So I was asking if there's a question in French, and I can translate.
Je comprends, je comprends.
But I think it's okay. This is the last session of the event, so I'm probably normal that people are a little bit tired. But great session. Thank you again, Michael.
Thank you so much.
Soon. Thanks. Hope to see you soon somewhere else in the world.
Yeah, Tahiti. Who knows? Maybe. Yeah, we'll see.
We'll see next time.
Okay. All right. Well, enjoy your evening. My day's just starting. I got to get to work.